The sound of the engine dying was the first sign. It was always the first sign. A deep silence rushed in to replace it, a quiet so profound it felt louder than the noise. Then came the second sign, the scent of pine needles baking in the late July sun. Elara Vance took a deep breath. She unbuckled her seatbelt before the car had even settled into its parking spot. This was it. The place. Their place. For 10 years, the third week of July meant this exact patch of dirt beside the Merced River. It meant the cold shock of the water, the taste of burnt marshmallows, and the shadow of Sentinel Dome watching over them. But for the last 3 years, it had also meant something else. It meant him. Before we continue, let us know from which city you are. We are interested to know from where our videos are watched. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave your rating. This gives us motivation to make new and interesting videos. So, let's get started. Her father, Mark, was already out of the driver's side, all business and efficiency. He pointed to a level spot for the main tent, his expensive hiking boots crunching on the gravel. Ellie, grab the poles. Sarah, can you start on the kitchen box? He was a man who conquered nature with gear and scheduling. He loved this place, but he loved it on his terms. Predictable. Safe. Elara barely heard him. Her eyes were already scanning the tree line. The familiar granite boulders, the tall ponderosa pines, the deep shadows between them. It was a game. A ritual. Would he be there to greet them? Her mother, Sarah, came around the car and put a hand on her shoulder. Her touch was warm and knowing. He'll show up when he's ready, honey. The forest doesn't run on a tech CEO's schedule. Sarah winked. She was the family's historian, the keeper of their traditions. She understood this place had a rhythm Mark's spreadsheets couldn't capture. Elara nodded, grabbing her camera from her backpack. It felt like an extension of her arm. She began her own ritual, walking the perimeter of the campsite. It was less about helping and more about searching. Her boots made soft sounds on the dusty ground. The air was warm, still. And then she felt it, a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, the feeling of being watched. She stopped. Slowly, she lifted her gaze to a large, sun-drenched slab of granite about 50 yards away. And there he was. Ghost. He wasn't hiding. He was sitting, perfectly still, his tawny coat a seamless part of the landscape. Only the slight twitch of his tufted ears gave him away. Elara recognized the small V-shaped notch in his left ear. It was definitely him. His golden eyes were fixed on her. Not with aggression, not with curiosity, just with an unnerving, ancient stillness. He was a wild thing, a predator, a creature of instinct. Yet every summer, he was here, a silent, waiting sentinel. Elara raised her camera, the lens a shield between her and that intense gaze. She focused, the autofocus whirring softly. Just as her finger pressed the shutter, he blinked once, slowly. Then, without a sound, he rose, turned, and melted into the shadows of the forest. Gone. Later that evening, the campfire crackled, spitting embers into the darkening sky. Mark was poking the logs with a stick, a small frown creasing his brow. "I don't like it, Sarah," he said, not looking at his wife or daughter. That was the third time today. He was just sitting there by the river while Ellie was skipping stones. Sarah sighed, pulling her blanket tighter. "Mark, he keeps his distance. He always does. It's just his spot. We're in his home, remember? His spot is getting closer every year," Mark countered, his voice tight with frustration. "A bobcat that isn't afraid of humans is a dangerous bobcat. Period. been fed by tourists or it's sick. It's not natural. Alara, who had been cleaning her camera lens, looked up. "He's not sick," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "And he's not looking for food. He's just watching." Mark turned to her, his pragmatic mind unable to compute her words. "Watching? Ellie, it's not a character in one of your fantasy books. It's a predator. A 30-pound cat with teeth and claws that has lost its instinctual fear of us. Of you. Tomorrow, I'm reporting it to the ranger station." Alara's stomach dropped. "What? No, Dad, you can't. They'll do something to him." "Good," Mark said, his voice flat and final. "That's the entire point. They'll solve the problem." He stood up, dusting off his hands. "It's for your own safety. End a discussion." He walked into the tent, the zipper closing with a sharp, definitive sound. Alara stared into the fire, the reflection of the flames dancing in her wide eyes. Her protector, her silent mystery, was now just a problem to be solved. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, what the Park Service did with problems they couldn't fix. The next afternoon, a forest green Park Service truck crunched to a halt near their site. A ranger stepped out. She was young, her uniform crisp, her dark hair pulled back in a severe bun. Her name tag read, Diaz. She walked with a confident, no-nonsense stride. Mark met her halfway, explaining the situation in calm, logical terms. Ranger Diaz listened, nodding, her expression unreadable. Alara and Sarah watched from the camp chairs. "Don't worry," Sarah whispered, though her own voice was strained. "They'll just observe him. They won't hurt him." But Alara saw the hard set of Ranger Diaz's jaw. She saw the way her eyes professionally scanned the area, not with wonder, but for threats, for liabilities. This was not a nature lover. This was an enforcer. After a few minutes, Ranger Diaz walked over to them. She held a clipboard. "Ma'am, miss," she said, her voice polite but firm. "Mr. Vance has reported an unusual level of wildlife habituation. We've had a few other comments about a bobcat in this area." She looked directly at Alara. "You should understand that when a predator loses its fear of humans, it becomes unpredictable. Our primary mission here is visitor safety." Alara found her voice. "He's not a threat. He just watches." Ranger Diaz's expression didn't soften. "That is the threat," she replied coolly. "That behavior is step 1. Step 2 is approaching for food. Step 3 is an incident. We have to interrupt the pattern before it gets to step 3. She made a note on her clipboard. "We will increase patrols in this loop. But I want you to be clear on the park's policy. If the animal continues to exhibit level 2 habituated behavior, we have protocols." Mark nodded in grim satisfaction. "Thank you, Ranger." But Alara felt a knot of ice in her chest. "Protocols?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "What kind of protocols?" Ranger Diaz looked her straight in the eye, her gaze unflinching. "Hazing with noise deterrence. If that fails, relocation. And if relocation is not feasible or fails..." She paused, letting the weight of her next words sink in. "As a last resort, for a confirmed problem animal that poses a public risk, the protocol is lethal removal." The deep green of the Park Service truck disappeared around the bend, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the air. The silence that followed was heavier than before, thick with unspoken words. Lethal removal. The phrase echoed in Alara's mind, a cold, sharp-edged thing. Mark let out a long breath, a sound of relief. "See? It's being handled. Professionals are in charge now." He looked at Alara, expecting her to understand, to also be relieved. but all she felt was a rising wave of panic and a cold, hard knot of anger. Sarah put a comforting arm around Alara's shoulders. "Honey, maybe it won't come to that. Maybe he'll just move on now that there are more patrols." But her voice lacked conviction. They all knew the truth. Ghost wasn't going anywhere. This was his home, and now his home had become a death trap. Alara pulled away, walking blindly towards the big metal footlocker her family kept their long-term camping supplies in. She needed to do something, anything, to stop the roaring in her head. She fumbled with the latch, her hands shaking. Sarah followed her. "What are you looking for, Elle?" she asked softly. "Let me help." Alara didn't answer. She just threw open the heavy lid. The scent of canvas, old metal, and mothballs wafted out. Inside was a jumble of family history. A rusty lantern from a decade ago, faded maps, a stack of photo albums. Sarah reached in and pulled out a thick, leather-bound book. It was worn at the edges, the cover stained with time. On the front, embossed in faded gold leaf, were 2 words: Arthur Vance. "Oh," Sarah said, a strange note in her voice. "I'd forgotten this was in here. It was my grandpa's. Your great-grandfather's old field journal." She handed the book to Alara. It felt heavy, important. Alara ran her fingers over the worn leather. Arthur Vance, the man she was named after, in a way. The legendary park ranger she'd only heard stories about. She opened it. The pages were thick and yellowed, covered in a precise, neat handwriting. They were filled with observations. July 12th, 1965. Sierra lily in bloom near the base of Bridal Veil Fall, 2 weeks later than last year. The pages were alive with detailed sketches of pine cones, bird feathers, and animal tracks. He was like her. He didn't just look, he saw. Then she turned a page and her breath caught. It was a sketch. A bobcat sitting on a granite boulder, its gaze intense and direct. The artistry was stunning. Below it, a single word: Watcher. For the next 24 hours, the journal became Alara's entire world. She barely ate. She ignored her father's frustrated sighs and her mother's worried looks. She sat cross-legged by the fire, long after everyone else was asleep, her face illuminated by her headlamp as she deciphered Arthur's careful script. He was a man of science and observation, not fantasy. He documented rainfall, soil acidity, elk herd movements. But his entries about the bobcats of this specific valley were different. There was a respect, a deep understanding that went beyond biology. He tracked their lineage, noting births and deaths, territories shifting like tides. While she was lost in the past, her father was dealing with the present. He'd gone for a walk up the trail and came back agitated. "They've put up survey markers," he announced to Sarah. "Just beyond the park boundary," I asked another camper. "Some company is trying to get a glamping resort approved, right on the edge of the wilderness." This news, which would normally outrage him, now seemed to solidify his resolve. A problem animal so close to a potential new development. The Park Service would be under immense pressure to act decisively. There would be no second chances for Ghost. Alara's heart pounded. She frantically flipped through the journal, a desperate idea forming in her mind. She needed a connection, a real one. She found it in a series of entries from August 1967. The handwriting was smudged, more hurried. August 14th, 1967. Fire jumped the South Fork. Crown fire moving at 20 mph. Wind is a devil. Smoke so thick it turned noon to midnight. Alara read on, her eyes wide. Arthur wrote about the evacuation order, a full retreat of all personnel. But he defied it. A gut feeling about the denning site near Sentinel. The she-cat from last spring. The one I call Watcher. She has new kittens. They won't outrun this. The next entry was written 2 days later. It described a scene from a nightmare. The world was smoke and ash. Arthur had driven his truck as far as he could and then ran, a wet bandana over his face. He'd found them, the mother Bobcat, cornered against a sheer rock face by a wall of flame, her kittens mewling at her feet. The description of the rescue was brutally practical. No sentimentality. Used my heavy canvas jacket. She hissed, drew blood from my arm, but she was too panicked to fight properly. Moved the kittens one by one across the fire break to the safety of the granite cave. She followed from a distance, never taking her eyes off me. He described her gaze, the same intense golden stare Alara knew so well. He left his canteen and a piece of jerky and retreated. The final piece fell into place, with a note from weeks later. She and her kin no longer flee at the sight of my truck on this patrol route. They hold their ground, and they watch. Alara's hands trembled. She grabbed one of the old creased maps from the footlocker. Tucked into the back of the journal was a smaller, hand-drawn map. Arthur's patrol route. She laid it over the modern park map. Her blood ran cold. The lines matched perfectly. His old route was the trail system they hiked every summer. The denning site he had saved, the granite cave, was less than a mile from their campsite. Ghost's territory was Watcher's territory. This wasn't a coincidence. It was an inheritance. But it wasn't proof. To her father, it was a sentimental story. To Ranger Diaz, it was an irrelevant, 60-year-old anecdote. She looked at the journal, at the drawing of Watcher. It wouldn't be enough. The image of the tranquilizer rifle and the crate flashed in her mind. They were coming for Ghost, and a story wouldn't stop them. A new fierce determination burned away her despair. She snapped the journal shut, the sound echoing in the quiet campsite. She stood up and faced her parents, her eyes blazing with an intensity that startled them both. "I know how to prove it," she said, her voice low and urgent. "I know who can make them listen. But we have to leave the park, right now." Mark floored the accelerator, the old family car kicking up gravel as they sped out of the campsite. The tension inside was a tangible thing. Mark drove with white-knuckled intensity, his jaw tight. He was only doing this because Sarah had insisted, her voice holding a rare edge of command. "We owe it to her to at least listen, Mark." Alara sat in the back, the heavy journal clutched to her chest like a shield. She directed them down a series of winding roads, away from the grandeur of the valley floor and into the sleepy town of Mariposa. They pulled up to a small single-story house with a porch full of wind chimes. An elderly man with a shock of white hair and kind, crinkled eyes was watering his roses. This was Ben Carter, the retired park historian. Ben listened, his expression shifting from polite interest to rapt attention as Alara laid out the story, her voice trembling but resolute. She opened the journal to the sketch of Watcher, then to the account of the 1967 fire. Ben leaned forward, his old eyes tracing the lines of the drawing. He let out a low whistle. "Arthur Vance," he said, his voice thick with reverence. "Of course, I knew Art. A man carved from the same granite as El Capitan. A legend. We all heard stories about him in the fire, but he never talked about it. To have his own account." He shook his head in wonder. "But will it be enough?" Alara pressed. "Will Ranger Diaz believe a story?" Ben looked at her, a shrewd glint in his eye. "No," he said bluntly. "She won't believe a story. She's a scientist, so you have to give her science." He leaned back in his chair. "It's not memory, kid. not like you and I remember our grandfathers. Think of it as a lesson, burned into their very survival instinct. The matriarch, Watcher, taught her kittens, fire is death, large predators are death. But that specific shape, that specific non-threatening human presence, in this exact territory, that is safe. It's a highly localized, learned behavior, passed down from mother to kitten because it was advantageous. It saved them energy. They didn't have to flee. He tapped the journal. This isn't a fairy tale, Ilara. This is an incredible 60-year field study of animal behavior. You're not just holding a storybook, you're holding data. The word hung in the air. Data. It was a word her father understood. Ilara saw a flicker of doubt cross Mark's face for the first time. Their return to the campsite was met with chaos. A small crowd was gathered, voices high with panic and excitement. A park service truck was already there, but it wasn't Diaz's. And in the center of the commotion, a young man was gesturing wildly, his face pale. It came out of nowhere. The drone was just hovering over the river, and the cat just launched at it. Ilara's stomach turned to ice. On the ground near the riverbank lay the shattered pieces of a quadcopter. Ghost was nowhere to be seen. Another camper chimed in. It was right here. It hissed at us. It wasn't scared at all. The narrative was already being written. Habituated, aggressive, a public danger. The phone call had been made. Diaz was on her way. It happened faster than Ilara could have imagined. The second parked truck, the one she recognized, screeched to a halt. Ranger Diaz jumped out, her face a mask of grim professionalism. This time, she wasn't carrying a clipboard. In her hands was a tranquilizer rifle. Two other rangers followed, one carrying a large transport crate. "Everyone back! Clear the area now!" Diaz commanded, her voice cutting through the noise. Her eyes swept the scene, saw the shattered drone, registered the panicked tourists. The pressure on her was immense. The new development proposal, the public incident, the checklist in her mind was complete. The time for observation was over. "There, on the rocks," someone shouted. Ilara whipped her head around. There he was. Ghost, drawn back by the commotion in his territory. He stood on a low boulder, tail twitching, watching the chaos with an unnerving calm. Diaz saw him. She raised the rifle, sighting the scope. "No." The word was torn from Ilara's throat. She ran. She didn't think. She just moved, planting herself directly between the rifle and the Bobcat. "Ilara, get back here right now," Mark yelled, his voice raw with terror as he started after her. But Sarah's hand shot out, grabbing his arm with surprising strength. "No, Mark," she said, her voice shaking but firm. "Let her." In that moment, she wasn't a mediator. She was the granddaughter of Arthur Vance, and she saw him standing right in front of her. "Ranger Diaz, stand down!" Ilara yelled, her voice ringing with an authority she didn't know she possessed. She held up the open journal. "You can't do this. This animal is not a threat. His behavior is a legacy." Diaz kept the rifle trained, her finger near the trigger. "Miss, I have a direct threat to public safety. Move aside now." "No, you need to listen." Ilara's words came out in a torrent, fueled by adrenaline and desperation. His ancestor was named Watcher. My great-grandfather, Ranger Arthur Vance, saved her from the fire of 1967 on this very land. It's not habituation. It's a learned behavior passed through generations. Ben Carter, the park historian, he confirmed it. This isn't a problem animal. He's a living piece of this park's history. She took a step forward, holding out the journal, her hand shaking violently. "Read it. It's all in here." The maps, the dates, the data. As the standoff reached its breaking point, Ghost made his move. He didn't charge. He didn't flee. He simply turned, and with the silent grace Alara knew so well, he flowed up the side of the massive granite slab behind him, the exact same sun-drenched rock where she had first seen him. He settled down, tucked his paws beneath him, and sat, watching them, calm, aloof, undisturbed, a silent, living testament to the 60-year-old words written in the book Alara was holding. Ranger Diaz stared, her eyes flicking from the defiant girl to the ancient journal, to the perfectly poised animal. The bobcat's serene confidence in the face of guns and shouting was unnatural. It was not the behavior of a normal wild animal, nor the behavior of an aggressive, habituated one. It was something else entirely. It was exactly what the girl was describing. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered the rifle. The click of the safety being engaged was the loudest sound in the world. She keyed her radio. "Dispatch, this is Diaz. Situation resolved. Stand down. The animal is non-aggressive and has vacated the immediate area." She looked at Alara, her professional mask finally cracking to reveal a flicker of awe. "That journal," she said, her voice low. "That's historical evidence. It may be exactly what we need." On their last day, Mark walked with Alara to the riverbank. The campsite was packed, the car loaded. "I was wrong," he said, staring at the forest. "I saw a problem that needed a logical solution. You saw a story that needed to be understood. There's more of Arthur Vance in you than I ever realized. I'm proud of you." It was more than an apology. It was a bridge rebuilt. Later, Alara took one last walk up the trail, her camera hanging by her side. She climbed to a high outlook, the one Arthur had marked on his map as his favorite observation point. Far below, moving through a patch of sunlight, she saw him. Ghost. He was not following her. He was patrolling the edge of his territory, a silent king in his wild kingdom. Alara raised her camera, but she didn't take a picture. She just looked through the lens, a quiet salute from one generation's watcher to another. Should Ranger Diaz have followed her orders to remove the animal? Or was she right to defy them based on Alara's story?